Started. All right, so welcome to another edition of my podcast. I have a very special guest today. She is a former Johnson Service Corps alum, which is a program that I also took part in. But now she is a filmmaker for Ironworx Media, that is. So this is Debbie Boo, and she's going to be hanging out with us today. So thank you for joining me.
Yeah,
And so, if you would like to give us like a brief introduction and background about yourself, that would be great.
sure. I've always been a storyteller ever since I was a kid. I would visit family, and I always had stories to tell, and somehow they would listen to all the stories that I had. And so I started as a bookworm, and then I got into writing my own content, and then I started doing theater classes in high school, and that was like an incredible creative outlet that I really needed at the time. Um, And so, when it was time to go to college, I got into UNC. I don't like calling it this way, but I did get kind of like a full ride. So I'm very honored by the
That's
public, school
that's cool.
system that it works. So my parents, they suggested I do something more practical rather than dramatic arts and creative writing. So I decided to put them together and thought I wanted to be a news anchor. So I studied journalism, and one of the class projects was a short documentary, and I absolutely fell in love with the concept. And mostly because it was allowing, interview subjects to have their own agency and tell their own stories and in a very unique way that's based on their perspective, rather than if I was a news reporter, I would end up centering myself in the story and kind of use a couple sound bites from the interview subjects. So I thought documentary filmmaking was much more of a sincere form of storytelling.
Hmm.
And then I double majored in communication studies with a concentration in media studies and production. And so, producing documentaries kind of lend itself into producing scripted content. They're very different beasts, though, as I learned for sure. There's a sense of instant gratification when you're making a documentary because the event happens once, then you got to capture it as much as you can.
Yeah.
Whereas with scripted content, you have to plan for so long, and things still kind of go awry on set. But it's an extraordinary feeling to put everything together before and then get on set and see all the magic happen. So there's pros and cons to the feelings that you get when you're making documentaries and scripted content. Graduated from college, got an amazing opportunity to go to Malawi in Africa to do an international documentary internship. And that was, the moment, that really solidified my career as a documentary filmmaker. I realized like I've known this for a while, but this is like for sure what I want to do for the rest of my life. Um, but job market was tough.
Yeah.
I wasn't ever good enough for all the jobs that I was looking into. There was always, they want you to do graphics and all this extra stuff that I didn't learn. And even though I knew how to do a lot of things, it just wasn't ever enough for some reason. So I kind of settled and tried to do some retail management. So I worked at Hollister for about 9 months, and that's just what you got to do when you're creative. You kind of have to sell your soul a little bit, but
I know exactly how you feel. I'm kind of dealing with the same thing. I'm a photographer, so I really wish I could do photography full time, but it's just like, well, you got to pay the bills because what you're doing right
yeah.
now is creative, not fairly consistent. That's kind of like the biggest downside of being an artist or like a creative person in
Oh,
general.
absolutely. Yeah. So I quit that job because I was filming a networking event through the same internship program, they revamped and decided to expand their business model. And so I was doing some video content for one of their networking events. And there I met a writer producer who was working on his feature film. And I told him, hey, I want to be, I want to work behind the camera. And so they brought me on board, and that was my first feature film that I worked on. And I was a second AC, which means camera assistant. So I was helping with like building the camera and just helping the first AC. And that, my first step on my first feature film was like, this is it. Like, I want to do this. This is so much fun. And to, be surrounded by other creatives and professionals, like really, sealed the deal for me there. So I went on to work on 2 feature films in San Francisco. And then I worked on another 2 feature films in New York. And I highly recommend living in a city that's, robust in filmmaking opportunities, because I wouldn't be where I am if it wasn't for that. New York is, I would say I'd recommend New York for sure, because you don't need a car, whereas LA, you need a car, and rent in both places is ridiculously high, but I'd recommend New York because you don't need a car to get around. You can take the, train, and it's ultimately more affordable. You will have to suffer through an hour commute if you live in Brooklyn trying to get into Manhattan. But, when you're younger, when you're early 20s, you are willing to do more for the good of the art,
Yeah.
So then I had my heart broken, and that kind of shifted things for me, realizing, hey, I want to make my own content rather than helping other people make their own content. So I decided to do a series of short documentaries on bodybuilders as like a promo series for a bodybuilding competition that my brother was hosting. And that was such an amazing experience. I got to film all day with a bodybuilder and then edit that same night. And I did that for 5 days in a row, and it was so cool, and like I said, it's so much easier to do a documentary because all you have to do is pick up a camera and like, search online, what are different events that are happening, or what are different nonprofits that, could really use video content to share their story, especially a nonprofit that has an incredible story to tell, and I also produced my first short film. Both projects got me into a couple of film festivals, so that was really cool. And I did, I did the series of documentary shorts on no budget, just one woman band at that point, and then my short film probably produced it for less than $400. So I recommend, trying to figure out how to cut costs. When you're first starting out, you will have to wear a lot of different hats, and I recommend it. It's, people think that it's harder to wear multiple hats on set, but it actually makes the process easier because you have more control over the process. And if you know one thing, it lends itself to the other thing. So, for example, I like the concept of writing to produce. So when you're writing a script, thinking about, if you have a cop car in there, for example, a feature film that I worked on, they didn't get a cop car. They just messed with the lighting. So it looked like the blue and red blinking lights, so they didn't need a car. They didn't need police officers. So kind of thinking about how can you produce, little details like that, and still carry out the message in the story. So after I produced my first short film and my documentary series, I came back to North Carolina and had a mental health crisis. And it took me about 2 years to kind of get over that. And, during that time, it was really hard because like, it felt like all my creativity was sucked out of me. Like I could not write, and writing was always therapy for me, but I could not write a single thought because my mind was so cloudy, and the medication was messing with me, and I didn't know, how to manage and cope with this now mental illness that I didn't know I had, but had coped in different ways, all my life. So I hit 26 and I got into the Johnson Service Corps program. This would be my second attempt at a year-long volunteer program. My first attempt was in Atlanta, and I had my second Manic episode, and that wrecked that opportunity. But I'm glad it happened, because I wouldn't have looked into Johnson Service Corps. I'd be closer to home so my parents could look out for me if something were to happen. But I was in a way better place than I'd ever been. And I ended up living with two other young women who were an incredible support system for me. And my work life, oh my God, I love the job. I was paired up with Step Up Durham, which provides employment readiness workshops. So we're teaching people how to, write resumes and do applications, and dressing, for interviews and whatnot, and actually practicing for interviews. So I never imagined that I would have that kind of job, because the longest job that I had before that was 9 months, in a retail management position. So it's just like ironic that I'm like helping people get jobs when I can't even like get my own like full-time job. But I'm a public speaker, I'm a storyteller. So, working with Step Up, I got to work there for 3 years, which is the longest that I've ever worked somewhere. And it was so nourishing. And eventually in 2017, so the next year after, the following year after JSC, I started my own production company. And it was all inspired by, the concept of iron sharpens iron. And a lot of people kind of think biblically when they hear that, saying. But for me, it just means that, I am a strong filmmaker and creative, and I have to surround myself with other strong creatives and filmmakers.
Absolutely.
And that's how we get better together. So collaboration and co-creation are the foundation for Ironworx Media. And I just didn't want to do things by myself anymore. You got to find people that like to do the things you don't like to do. So it's just a mutual beneficial relationship,
Yeah. And I think it's great that you brought up the Johnson Service Corps experience, because prior to me applying for it, like I was kind of going through similar things like mental illness and, having like those depressive episodes. I didn't medicate for a while. I think I did that after JSC, because that was kind of like I think being in JSC was kind of like my inspiration to kind of like go through with it, and also go through like my career as a photographer. I think like having that year of service where it's just like you're working full time, but like not really, but because you still have like that time where you really want to reflect and kind of like really give yourself that time to like think about next steps. So when you were talking about your experience, it kind of made me a little nostalgic, because I was also in Durham and I was with the Pauli Murray Center, and I loved that place, loved it. I still support it today. And it really like, it was like a creative awakening for me. Granted, I was doing like social media stuff, but I was also doing like photography and like filming events. And it just like really gave me the opportunity to really like hone my skills as a photographer. And just the supervisors that I had, they really believed in me to the point where they actually was able to get me like a class, like a photography class on Duke's campus where, the offices was based. And it was just like a very life-changing moment for me. It's just like, oh wow, I really can do this. So I kind of like, after I left JSC, I kind of went through with like my photography business. Granted, things are kind of like halted because of the pandemic, but I was still able to like get paid like photo shoot opportunities and like being able to collaborate with a lot of very artistic people. And a lot of them I met in Durham, and I still like foster those relationships with them. So it was like a really like thought provoking program for me. Like, did you feel the same way while you were there?
Oh yeah, for sure. I owe everything to JSC, I keep trying to tell people like it's an incredible opportunity because you're guaranteed, a year-long employment, which is really hard to find when you're coming out of college.
And you
So
get a place to live,
you get a place
comfort.
to
You get
you
all your
get
basic
food.
necessities.
Yeah, exactly. And it's you got to compare it to living at home. You know, you if you're living at home, you get your rent paid, you get your food paid technically. But you're not surrounded by people your own age. You're surrounded by, your parents and your family who don't really get you.
Yeah,
But with JSC, you're surrounded by people who are accepting this like next stage in their life, and hopefully they're ready for the community, aspect of it. And I've seen people leave because they weren't ready for that.
mm,
But what I compare with intentional community, I compare it to like they're your roommates, but you also have to talk to them. Like you have to build relationships with them, and you're, I don't want to say stuck with them, but you know you came into the program to commit to a year to your community, your intentional community. So you have to be open, and you know sometimes just people aren't ready for that level of connection. But
absolutely.
I was fortunate that like my two community members were ready to connect, and we adored each other, we loved each other. One of them is actually going to be the officiant for me and my fiance's wedding. She graduated from Yale Divinity School, and then the other one's going to be at my wedding party. So like these connections, are can be lifelong if you want it to be.
Absolutely. I know when I was with JSC, I was with the larger group. So it was 11 of us total. So I had 4 roommates in a Durham house. And then, in Carborough, it was like five people in one house. But my closest friends that I made were in both houses. And we managed to like connect and, really like foster a very close relationship. And I think it's great because both of them are still in North Carolina, especially in the Triangle, which I'm very happy about. So I can hopefully, potentially, once everything's kind of like gets back to normal, so to speak, I can finally like link up with them. But it, I know when I first went into the Johnson Service Corps, I was the youngest out of everybody. So I think, and I was only 20. The legal like age to get in the program is like 21, but they still let me in anyways, which I thought was interesting, but okay. And at first I kind of felt out of place because it was kind of like a 3-year age difference between myself and like another person, like the second youngest person. And they had been like out of college for like at least a year at that point. So
Yeah.
I was like kind of like in my little cocoon for a little bit, but if it wasn't like for me, like actually, connecting with my roommates and like having like those conversations, and especially like when we have like those dinners, I think it's kind of like nice that JSC like requires like the roommates to like have like dinners or like kind of roommate get-togethers to like for us to bond. I think if it wasn't for that, I probably wouldn't have like really came out of my shell. So that's like what I love about JSC. It kind of challenged me to just be more open to like have conversations and just get out of my shell a little bit, and it really helped me a lot. And then in like the work setting, especially working at Poly Murray Center, it helped me grow creatively but also professionally because my supervisors, Barbara and Rochelle, I'll just say their names, they are very full of experience, wealth of knowledge, and they kind of pushed me to like really step up my game like creatively and as like a professional. So I think the one thing that kind of pulls people away from like those year-long volunteer services is like the pay, because you're getting like a stipend per month. You're not like getting like a pay salary. But I think like the experience is more valuable than like the stipend. So I have like really fond memories of being in that program, and I recommend it to people every chance I get. Yeah. So you establish your film company. What's are like the genres of film do you focus on? I know it's like very documentary based as I checked out your website. Very, very deep, so to speak. I love documentaries. That's like my favorite style of films. So are there any other film genres that you're focusing on or you would like to try out, or is the documentary style more of your go-to?
Yeah. So right before the pandemic, we had decided to shift and pivot to produce more narrative projects. And so, but then pandemic happened and that just shook us up and we didn't know how to adapt just yet.
Mhm.
Um, but fortunately with documentary productions, our crew sizes were already going to be super small anyway. We usually have maybe 4 or 5 people on set as the crew and then the interview subject and several interview subjects. So we could always keep it under at, definitely under 10 people. So,
Yeah.
with COVID, it challenged us, but then also made us realize like nothing really has to change. We just have to wear masks, that's a huge difference. And, make sure everybody's tested, negative for COVID. Um, and having hand sanitizer and extra masks and whatnot. So, with COVID, we were able to kind of focus on pre-production on a lot of projects. So I actually wrote a feature film that, we filmed the first scene 2 months ago. We filmed the first scene of my feature film about me and my mom and, our language barrier, but, the spirit of the kitchen brings us together. And so like that whole feature film was written maybe less than 12 to 14 weeks over the course of that period of time. So probably like 3-ish months to write a feature film, which is like the most accelerated, program that I've done. Um, so I'd recommend, uh, you know, uh, writing to kind of, it's like a time capsule, when you're writing something
Yes.
autobiographical. So I with each of those scenes in that feature film, it was all inspired by advice and wisdom that my mom imparted onto me. A lot of it is fictional. Like almost the entire script is fictional because the characters had to be developed and a couple of characters were just like fusions of like several family members that I've had. Um, so we're before COVID, we were able to produce back in 2019. We produced a short film that was really about mental health and schizophrenia and how it impacts, a caretaker relationship. So, for me, the genre that I'm really drawn to, it's kind of like people on my team and interns, they can share their scripts with me and their ideas with me. And then if I
Yeah.
like it enough, then I help them develop it. And then we go do writers meetings and get a couple of people together and like read the script together. And then we can fine tune it here and there. So I don't genre wise, I guess like drama stuff, real live. But we also, we have a comedy web series that I've been, fostering that idea since I first moved to Durham back in 2016. Um, so genre wise, I'm like all over the place. I don't
Uh,
really like no one will be able to figure out what's like the thread that ties it all together. But I think it's good to specialize, right? Like if you're a horror fan, figuring out what are the tropes of like horror films,
yeah.
and kind of playing into that or doing the complete opposite, like really study, the genres that you're most interested in. But don't be afraid to explore other genres as well.
Mm.
But I'm really big about elevating stories that we don't really see or hear very often. So that's, if, diverse groups of people share their stories with me, I really want to, highlight the good that's happening in the progress. I think that's like my theme when it comes to documentaries is that, not every story is a success story, but it's a story of progress. Um, and I don't think we should be afraid of failure either.
Yeah.
Because failure kind of gives us the recipe to actually get to that success. And it's all about experimentation, what works here, what didn't work here, you know, and getting to success a lot faster.
Absolutely. And I'm like a huge film fan. I love films. I love the history of films and just like the cinematography, just like the whole process of what, makes a film. So being that you are heavily involved in like the writing process, is there like a certain way that you go about it? Is there like a certain strategy or inspiration that comes to you? Or is it like a case by case basis? It depends on like the topics that's presented to you or that you find inspiring.
Yeah, so you know, my process when it comes to working with other people's scripts is we get together a couple people, like some interns, some people who are a little more seasoned. We get together and we read through the entire script without stopping, and we can take notes along the way. And then we share our feedback. So the writer always gets to, you know, speak on their own piece, and then everybody else can share their feedback, and then I'm the last one to share my feedback because I really want to, you know, I really want other people to vocalize their feedback before I even, you know, speak on it myself. Because sometimes we, you know, we share the same thoughts, you know. If that's a good sign if like there's a lot of overlap when it comes to feedback, because it's like, okay, this is a glaring issue, or this is a glaring awesome, you know, aspect of the script. So we always want to share, you know, the good feedback, and we also want to share the constructive criticism, you know,
Absolutely.
because that's the way we get better. And you know, hopefully by this point, people, you know, if they're putting their script out for us to read, they have a thicker skin so they can handle, you know, that type of level of constructive criticism. Um, so and then after the feedback session, we go back through the script and we read it word for word and decide, you know, what words to keep, change, or omit. So we're going literally word for word and figuring out like what we want to keep and what we don't. So that's the process, a three-step
Yeah.
process in our writers meetings. I know a lot of other people do it in different ways, but I find it a lot more gentle this way, you know, especially letting the writer speak for themselves, because I know some writing meetings, they don't let the writer speak at all, which is ridiculous because we need to know the insight and the perspective of the
Yeah,
writer.
that makes no sense because it's kind of blocking the writer from really like expressing like what they put on paper. And
Yeah.
sometimes it's good to have the writer, break down like that process. Like yes, it's on paper and you see it, but even verbally, they may even explain it differently or have like various ways of interpreting it, and then of course translating it onto that film space.
Yeah.
And with every process, like especially the writing process, is subject to change anyways. So it is good to have like that conversation going throughout the process just to
Mhm.
see how things evolve. So that's why I find like film so intriguing. Like same with photography, it's kind of like you're taking a picture, but what's in that picture, the angles, everything. What story are you trying to tell with that image? Especially if you're like doing a photo shoot with someone, it's like very like imperative that you have like some kind of concept that you're working off of. I mean, it's kind of quite different from like writing a script, of course, but I think the process is kind of the same. You got like a concept and you can kind of like build on it from there. And that's why I find like the screenwriting and like the scripting kind of more intriguing than the actual like cinematography itself, because you can like say like a word or say like a line, but sometimes it may like come off differently depending on like the actor or actress, or like in a documentary where it's something that's like more raw and real, like you can tell, as in contrast to like a script where, it's kind of like character based. So I just think it's very intriguing. And to kind of like go off of that, out of like the projects that you've done so far, like what are some of like your personal favorites? Like I know you probably have an attachment to all of your projects that you've done. You have like some kind of memory with all of them, but are there some projects that stood out to you more than others?
Yeah, absolutely. My second short film, which is not public yet, but it's going through a film festival circuit. It's been at it for over a year now. I'm so proud of that piece. I saved up my own money, $5,000 for production itself, and then it was collecting dust for a while because I didn't want to edit it myself. But then, over the next year, I met Francis Lay, who would end up being the editor for Roll Pin Punch. And so I think of it like, even though it took us like 7 years from the first, script until the final product, sometimes projects take time. For example, like Inception is like almost my all-time favorite film. It took 10 years. It took
Yeah.
Christopher Nolan 10 years, from the idea to finally, releasing it in movie theaters. So I don't think you should rush. I think, with time will solve most problems. Like I've been involved with projects that we've pushed, several times, pushed dates, but then realizing, okay, now we have a location that we didn't have before when we were trying to shoot this. Now I'm meeting other people that can do things that we've been looking for. So Rope and Punch, my second short film, I'm very attached to that project. It's so good. Like I gathered the right people, and it was a labor of love, and I'm so proud of what it's been able to do in the film festival circuit. I thought it would do better, but people have assured me that my ratio of like selections and rejections is on the right track. So, and it was, the first script is so different from the final script that we ended up with. I wanted some more diversity in the actors, so I had like an Asian character, a Hispanic character, and a Black character, all women. But as time went on, and thinking about production, I realized I needed to cut locations and cut characters. So we ended up having just five actors in the film, and then we cut locations. So then it ended up being like a 2-day shoot. So we had one house, an Airbnb that we got, represented as 3 different locations, 3 different residences. And then we through the fight choreographer, he introduced us to a gym in Wilson, North Carolina. So it was like an hour drive. And that gym was gorgeous. Oh my God, it was gorgeous. So, like to think, if we tried to do what I originally thought, it would have been more locations, more characters, and it wouldn't have been as easy to produce, because there were a lot more moving parts if I left it the way it was. And I love the way it ended up. It was like it went through enough people, and I call each person a creative filter, and it went through enough people so we could come up with a very concise story, that was very limited in dialogue. Actually, it was very, action based, and more of showing the story than telling the story. So you got to come up with like a good balance of that. So I'm attached to that darling. I put in $5,000 of my own money into it, so of course I'm going to be very attached to it.
Absolutely. And I think another thing, I like how you like refer to like your cast as like creative filters, because I think that it kind of rings true to, what one can bring to the table in terms of like their skills, and then like the way they can interpret the script, like either like through their emotions or through like the way they speak, I mean, through the dialogue. And I am also like a huge fan of action movies. That's why I also think it's very cool that you have like a fight choreographer in your movies, in your short film as well. So I think another question I would have for you is, are there, you know, maybe other filmmakers that are local to North Carolina, or maybe some more well-known filmmakers that are like sources of inspiration to you? Like, who influences you the most when it comes to like your style of filmmaking, would you say? That sounds like a lot of people, right?
Well, I mentioned before, you know, Inception was my all-time favorite movie. I think
That's an incredible movie. That's an incredible movie.
Yeah, Christopher Nolan's probably my favorite director, based on his work. But I would like to have, you know, a person of color be my favorite too, you know, or a woman, you know. But I'm not seeing that yet. Obviously, Bong Joon-ho, you know, he did Parasite, and that was phenomenal. And
that's an amazing movie.
It was one of the rare movies that I could like actually like, oh, I want to see more. Like, keep giving me the story. I want to watch this, you know. Movies for me are challenging because I can't pay attention for too long. Like, I'm pretty sure I have ADHD. And so, you know, seeing what movies do, you know, they spend like maybe half an hour for exposition and then they get into the action. I appreciate movies that just get right into it. For example, I just recently saw Alive, which is on Netflix, which is about like a zombie apocalyptic, you know, world. They got right into it, you know, like within the first 5-10 minutes, they're like, okay, this is happening. And now
I'm like that as well.
Yeah. And that's why I love TV shows. I actually prefer TV shows over movies, because, you know, with sitcoms, they're like 20 minutes. And so it's contained, and it's, you know, it's like a mini movie, you know, like you get right into the action, and you laugh along the way. Like, a couple of favorites is like animated TV shows like Bob's Burgers. Like, that got me through a hard time. That got me through a rough time, that show. So, you know, I'm hoping that I can say someone else is my favorite director who's a person of color or a woman.
I feel like that too.
Yeah. And I still have to see Nomadland. That was like, you know, the director was an Asian woman, so that was a big fat deal. And so I got to watch that, but I'm not sure if I'll like it or not. We'll see. So, you know, also like Duffer Brothers came from Durham, which is, I think, right? They did Stranger Things, and I'm like, good for you guys. Like,
that blew me away.
One connection away. I'm like one connection away from them. So, which is pretty cool. You know, I love when creatives honor where they came from. You know, there's like, I think there's some like few subtle things that the Duffer Brothers incorporated into their work, I think. But I love it when, you know, creatives do that. They honor where they came from, and because, like, you know, Durham probably influenced them tremendously, you know, and it's always important to give back to the community that fostered your talents and your growth.
Yeah, I think I'll go ahead and say some of my favorite directors. It's kind of sad though, because most of them are male. My favorite Black woman director though is, I cannot pronounce her last name, but her first name is Ava.
Yeah, DuVernay or something.
Yeah, Ava DuVernay. I love her. But my other favorites are Robert Rodriguez, Quentin Tarantino, a Spanish film director, Luis Buñuel. He's like early 1900s. So, and then animation, I love Betty Boop and Popeye the Sailor Man. Those are my favorite cartoons. So I love the Fleischer Studios. I actually like Fleischer Studios, but I like Walt Disney Studios. I don't say that to a lot of people though. Most of my friends are Disney fans, so I don't say that a lot. But I like the more like surrealistic, like supernatural type films, especially like with Quentin Tarantino's movie From Dusk Till Dawn. That's like one of my favorites of his. It's kind of gory, but I like the plot.
Oh, Quentin's all about the gore.
Oh,
That's a signature.
I was watching Death Proof the other day, and I forgot about how utterly gory that movie was. That's kind of like a collaboration between him and Robert Rodriguez. They did that together.
Oh yeah, it was Death Proof, and then the other film was
like Grindhouse or something.
Yeah, Grindhouse. Yeah.
Yeah. And then Robert Rodriguez. I think I like Robert's stuff a little more. I mean, still kind of gory, but at least there's kind of like a more stable plot. Quentin's plots tend to like flip flop a little bit, especially like Pulp Fiction. You have to watch it all the way from the beginning because it jumps plots and it jumps timelines, and then it gets kind of confusing, and I can't stand it. But one of my all-time favorite movies is Desperado, and that's a Robert Rodriguez film. I watched that movie hundreds of times, and I still can't get over it. And I love a movie with a good soundtrack. If you have like a very incredible soundtrack, then I'll automatically fall for you. I think that's why I gravitate towards those directors that I named, because of the incredible soundtracks. Mm-hmm. I don't know, music and films, it just 2 in 1. They just go so well together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, like Quentin Tarantino has, in Kill Bill, where she sees red, it's like that, that song. It's like, I can't even do it, but it's like anytime you hear that, you immediately think of that scene. And same thing with Reservoir Dogs. I haven't even seen the movie, but there's that one. There's that like torture scene, and you hear the song, and without the movie itself, the song seems like cheery and upbeat. But once you put that, as the soundtrack of a torture scene, you automatically think of that, and like, for example, what brought that up was like Bob's Burgers. Like, they kidnap a food critic, and then one of the people is like, I'm going to give him a wet willy. And so you just hear that, they just like remake that scene with like a wet willy, so it's like, music does do that to us, like we can, we have something associated with, I mean, with every song, like any song that you hear, on the radio, or, it brings you back to that first time you heard it, or, like Bruno Mars, 24 Karat. Like my fiance told me, like, the first time we heard it was like going inside of a Walmart, and like he remembered that was my first time hearing it. So it's like, it's very interesting how like music connects to our memory.
Yeah, and another, like, it's a subgenre of films, but it's called blaxploitation, and it's kind of like centered on like issues that were going on during in the African American community during the 1970s. And what's interesting, like timeline wise, it became popular right after, like, towards like the end of the civil rights era. I'd say the first blaxploitation film was filmed in 1969. So like, crazy enough, it was like a year after Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination. They started like doing those films. And in a way, it was kind of like a pushback against the civil rights movement, because they talk about the issues like, the war on drugs and, treatment of Black women. And the cinematography can be a little cringe at times, but I like the messages that they kind of try and get out to the people. And it afforded a lot of opportunities for Black actors, actresses, Black musicians when they make like the complete soundtracks for the films. And even like the female stars, they had like some of the earliest female action stars were African American, and it was mainly due to like that blaxploitation film genre. I don't know if you know who Pam Grier is, but yeah, she was actually in Jackie Brown, the Quentin Tarantino movie in the 90s. Mm-hmm. It was kind of like a tribute to like her characters in the 70s, like Foxy Brown and Coffee.
Yeah.
She was born in Winston-Salem, so she's a North Carolina native.
I thought I read somewhere that Quentin Tarantino's original script was it was a white woman, and then they changed it.
Yeah, I read
And they
that too.
met Pam Grier. Like, isn't that amazing? Like,
Yeah.
that's what I'm talking about. Creative filters is like, you wouldn't, you know, I'm in a web series called .org, and it's a mockumentary series about an environmental nonprofit. And I ended up being cast as a role that I didn't even audition for. They just saw this character in me while I was auditioning for a different character who had a completely different personality. So I thought that was interesting, because like I wasn't even drawn to this character, but I got cast as that character because I brought something to it, which I'm so grateful that I'm that character, because like I'm a sassy bitch. So like, I can do those roles, and I'm really grateful that I got cast that way, for sure. I just, I was auditioning for someone else, and then, I got looked at for someone else. So I think that's really cool when they can adapt to the actors that they cast. And I was in this other web series about a zombie roommate, and the character in the script was named Frankie Reyes. So the writer is Hispanic, so I think she saw herself, because that's what writers do. They see themselves in the character, the protagonist or the antagonist. But they changed her name to Frankie Cho because of how I look. So I kind of have like mixed feelings about that. I'm like, I could still be Frankie Reyes. Like, it could be explained, but they kind of wanted to like honor, the Asian American heritage that I come from.
I see. Which kind of brings it to like, this is like one of my last questions, but I feel like it's most important. So my biggest thing about like films these days is like representation. And do I feel like people are doing a much better job with like putting like representation on like, the most marginalized communities? I still kind of feel like that we still have further to go in that regard. So I was like kind of wanting to know like kind of like your thought process on that. Being that you had just mentioned like being, cast as like Frankie Cho, but they was gonna give you another name originally. Like being like people of color, like I know if I were an actress, I would want to be represented, as African American woman. But you don't want to like unfortunately cross that boundary to like being typecast. Like that's kind of like my thing. So I just wanted to know like your thoughts on that.
Yeah, like you're saying, people actually are caring more about representation. Maybe they cared this whole time, but with with a bunch of different scandals in Hollywood, that has really, people were realizing that the mass public actually do want to hear these marginalized stories. So it's so important for me as a writer to kind of leave it open to, the type of ethnicity that these characters are. Sometimes I force, these characters to be a certain way, like a feature film that I wrote was based on me and my young Black female friend. And so I made sure that the character inspired by me was Asian, written as an Asian character, and the other person was written as a Black character. And but then sometimes people cast and they say any ethnicity. And I think it's really important to honor whoever they cast as any ethnicity. They honor that person's culture and heritage and include that somehow in the script. Whether their culture impacts them and their decision making, because it does. And for me, as an actor, I see so many casting notices on like Facebook groups that I'm in, that will either say, African American, Black, white, Caucasian, these, and that's it. And the only roles that I can even look into that are similar or closest to me as any ethnicity, because they don't, I feel like if you're not Black, if you're not white, you're forgotten. You are not represented at all. And so recently, you know, I'm seeing a lot more Asian representation. And I saw an article saying that, you know, these movies that are based around martial arts are, you know, helping Asian Americans have agency over their own narrative. But I'd like to counter that, because why is it just martial arts? Like, why is that like, why is that
I
the
have some
only,
words.
why is that like the only way that Asian actors can get a job is if it's rooted in martial arts? Like, you know, it's that type of stereotype that makes it difficult to, you know, to get out of, you know. And like you said, people get typecast, you know. And I said earlier that I am the sassy bitch, which is counter to what people think of when they think of like an Asian woman, you know. So I do stand out in a good way, but then I also stand out in, you know, I you know, I like to think like, if you cast me, you've got diversity. And like, if I enter a room, your room has diversity because I exist, because I am a Vietnamese American woman. And I just wish there was more of an effort to like be more inclusive, rather than just have casting calls that ask for African American or Black, white, or Caucasian. You know, I feel like we're missing so much opportunity to explore
Absolutely.
cultures and heritages that aren't our own, or that aren't the mainstream. So it's hard for me as an actor to get roles because I don't fit
Like,
the racial lines that they're trying to divide us through.
it's just over the course of film history. Like, you can tell like that big disparity in representation. And when you do get like a person of color in, you know, a film setting, is very stereotypical. Like, I think of one of the classic films, but it's kind of cringy and it's a little too long, Gone with the Wind. And you have Hattie McDaniel, you know, African American woman, you know, she's big, curvy, but she's typecast as a maid. And I always had a big issue with like African American actors and actresses like being typecast as like either maid servants or even worse, slaves. So so I think about, you know, the way people of color are depicted based on like the stereotypical of like what, call it spade to spade like it is, especially during like the golden age of films, like through the eyes of like a white filmmaker, what people of color, depending on that person of color's like ethnicity or background, like what they should be or what they should look like. And don't even get me started on, you know, blackface or like the blatant cultural appropriation
Oh
of
yeah.
other people's cultures. That'd be a whole nother video. But it is very apparent of the big representation issue throughout the history of film. And going to back to what you mentioned about the martial arts films, is just like, to be honest, some of the most popular films that I've seen with Asian American or Asian actors or actresses had something to do with martial arts. And, you know, it kind of takes away from, you know, the other raw and deep, compelling stories and experiences that, you know, various Asian cultures have. If you typecast like a big global demographic of people into that one box, then it kind of really takes away from the variety of experiences and cultures. And that's like my biggest issue with like representation. That's why I say like we're doing a great job, but we have so much further to go. So
much. Oh my God. Yes.
That's a lot more to unpack, because now you
Yeah.
have, okay, there's a lot of Afro-Indigenous people. You know, Indigenous folks, they want to, you know, be represented more. And then a a lot of other groups of people that feel that they're not being heard and they want to be represented more. So I agree, especially as African American, and I feel that African American actors and actresses, we're like getting tons more opportunities, contrast to like over a century ago in terms of like films, music, entertainment, wherever the case may be, arts wise. So I'm not interested in being an actress, but I am connected to some friends who are in that sphere. So I am in some of those groups, like the casting groups, and I would like see that like consistently, like African American male, African American female, white male, white female. And then every now and then you have like maybe like a Hispanic male and Hispanic female every now and then. But
Yeah.
it makes me cringe.
Oh
It really
yeah.
makes me cringe.
It's awful. It sucks. Oh my God. I need an agent because I'm not getting any work by looking at these casting calls because like they don't want me. You know,
Yeah,
I'm not, you know, and kind of like what you're saying, like Black actors are usually the biggest opportunities are like slavery movies or, you know, civil rights movies. It's like that's not the only thing about Black people. Like there's all this other stuff. What about gentrification? Like, you know, there are, you know, and there's also, you know, police brutality type of, you know, short films that are popping up here and there. And it's like, it's so awful that we tie, you know, the Black identity to violence, you know, violence against these communities, which is
exactly.
true. And like, I do like, these stories should be honored, but at the same time, like, can't we see like a Black character, you know, in a different light? Like, you know,
More
there's
positive, more like triumphant, and like showing the innovative and triumphant side of
yeah,
this, rather than
exactly.
just like, the tragedy sides of, like, whenever I see like a biopic or whatnot, like I get a little tense because I'm just like, okay, so what are they trying? How are they trying to depict us now? Or and then you like, I want to support, but it's just like if you're still like hammering down those same like ideas or like intersecting like the Black experience with violence, which obviously that's a terrible part of our history, but there's a lot of positive things about the Black experience too that should be highlighted. Then I can't really support it if that's all you're going to try to depict. I just feel like there's so many aspects of history of not just Black people, but other people of color, that there are some great, tremendous stories out there, but they're just not in the mainstream because maybe they just don't feel like it needs to be heard, or maybe it hasn't been talked about enough, so maybe people don't make films about it. Like it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of like a gray area for me, but I just kind of wish like there's some more variety in the stories that are being told. And I think another point to bring up is like that life imitates art kind of thing. So when I went to college, I went to Meredith College, by the way, and I was an international studies major. So I had to take an international course in order to graduate. So I took Modern China, and we had to study like a famous Chinese figure throughout history. So I chose the Chinese American actress Anna May Wong. She was born in the United States, but she did not go to China until later on in her life, which I found to be interesting. But nonetheless, she was like the first Chinese actress to like really be well known in Hollywood, but she was still typecast in like those very stereotypical Asian woman roles, which are just disgusting. I mean,
It's awful. Oh my God.
she was a great actress. Don't get me wrong. I'm not discrediting her work, but I've seen some of her movies just to kind of like study her, made me cringe. Especially when like her lover will be like the main white male
Right.
actor,
Yeah.
and then it's kind of like she's like very submissive, or the white male actor is kind of like saying like he like expects her to love him because he's rich and he has all this money. Disgusting. But But even then, it's kind of like that fear of, okay, if you seem like a person of color being portrayed this way on the screen, then there's probably going to be that assumption that in real life they're going to be like that too.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you
Oh
hear
yeah, the me
many,
love
many
you long
stories
time.
about that.
Oh God.
Yeah, so that's why I always like hammer down the importance of being careful of putting like a story or a plot of a film or even a TV show, same thing, a TV show in that same position. Because granted, today people are much better of like knowing better, like, okay, this is TV. You know, obviously not everyone's like this in real life, but back in the day, that was a completely different story. So yeah, I was like, she was a very interesting person, very progressive for her time. But the movies that she was in, though she was a great actress, I
Didn't
couldn't.
do her justice either,
Yeah.
like
Well,
that's probably all she was offered.
absolutely.
Those were the options there. And when you're an actor, you kind of take whatever comes your way because it's rare and it's hard to get roles, And so like as an actor, you kind of sacrifice your integrity in a little way because, this is a role and this is available for me right now. And some people don't speak up either.
Yeah.
They just take the script as it is rather than kind of vocalize because the structure of power it's so strong other like no other way to put it, but like the hierarchy is tough to battle when you're an actor, and so that's why I love when I see in credits that actors are also producers because they have some creative control over how their character is portrayed. So
Absolutely.
commend those actors for putting themselves out there and like being in leadership in that way because actors are exploited.
Mhm. So, kind of like my final question, what would be some words of advice you would give to aspiring filmmakers?
Yeah. Find people who like to do the things you don't like to do. And I said that before and I'm going to say it again. Find people who like to do the things you don't like to do. And that's just like the perfect pairing. So, find your network, find the people that are important to you, but also don't sacrifice your quality and your integrity for other creatives that aren't in the right or aren't in the same mindset as you are. Make sure that these creatives that you're getting involved with have similar values to you, and that will, you know, that you can also talk to and have candid conversations and be frank but also be fair to each other. I think
Mm,
it's really important that collaboration is what drives you as a creative. um, and you don't have to do everything by yourself. I did it and a lot of people who are in the field have done it too, but it comes to a point where your art suffers if you do it all by yourself. So make sure that you're connecting and networking, but also do your research on each of these people that you are thinking about getting involved with, because
yes.
maybe their quality isn't like yours, and you do not want to be associated with people who don't share your level of quality and values.
That's some great advice. I think we can cap it off from there. I just want to say thank you for this very insightful conversation. I think I learned a lot more about, the filmmaking process and what it takes to actually create a film, whether it's a short film, a feature film, wherever the case may be, and just like to get to know you a little more. I mean, I know we met briefly, when I was in Johnson Service Corps, so it's good to like actually have a chat, even if it is virtually. So thank you for coming on board and being able to take part in my podcast. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity and thank you for reaching out. I want to share my story. Some people don't take advantage of my story very often. I'm like, I have so much advice. Like, please talk to me. I want to share because like that's what we should be doing with each other is giving each other shortcuts, you know. I can say one sentence of the lesson that I learned over the course of several months. I could tell you one sentence from what I learned and save you those, you know, few months that I, you know, had to sacrifice so I could learn that, you know. So I believe that we should always give each other shortcuts and talk to each other and give advice and tell stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a firm believer in that too. But thank you so much. And thank you everyone for tuning in to this very insightful talk. I hope you learned a lot more about Debbie and Ironworx Media, and just look forward to all the incredible projects that she has. So thank you all again. Bye. Thank you, Debbie.
Bye. Thanks for listening.